Okay, well, today we're here to talk about an invasive weed called the stinkwort. We'll get into why it's called that in a minute. I'm pleased to welcome Claire Elliott, who's senior ecologist with Grassroots Ecology. Grassroots Ecology just recently spun off from Acterra, which people know about. It's been a long time.
Acterra stewardship program became Grassroots Ecology.
Yeah, well, thank you for being here.
Yeah, glad to be here.
I'm kind of curious about your relationship with Stinkwort and when it kind of came into your awareness and what your organization does.
Okay, well, Grassroots Ecology has been around for many years in different forms. We were originally, as part of Peninsula Conservation Center, working on Arastradero Preserve as stewards. And so our overall mission over the years has been to involve the community in stewarding land and water resources. So we have thousands of volunteers come out every year and work with us to monitor creeks and remove invasive species. We have a nursery that grows locally specific native plants that evolved with the ecosystem here.
Is that the one up at Foothills
Yes,
Park?
it's up at Foothills Park, and we have a partnership with the city where we use the space to grow plants and provide services to the park. Some of the plants go to the park, and then we have volunteers that work on projects at the park there too.
Great.
So yeah, we've got a number of projects in open space areas, but we're also working on urban ecology, trying to get people to create more ecosystems in the city, and to do that in a way that also conserves water and harvests rainwater to recharge our ground and reduce flooding.
It's quite a range.
Yeah, lots of different things. So we have educational programs in the schools, as well as every volunteer event, we also do some form of education.
So I think the idea that there are some plants here that are thriving, but they either shouldn't be here or they have some sort of threat. It's something that maybe people, when they're hiking, don't really think about. I mean, I've seen stinkwort unknowingly. Now that I see what it looks like, I've seen it from the trails, and I don't give it a second
And
thought.
every freeway on-ramp and off-ramp just about has it right now because it's being transported by vehicle wheels, and it gets under the underbody of the cars and shakes out that way, tiny little seeds that get stuck in things.
So why is it a threat? Why?
Stinkwort is
bad?
like a number of invasive species that it has a lot of seeds. Every plant makes thousands of seeds, and they're tiny and they blow around, and so they get established in places, mainly in disturbed places. That's one advantage of the stinkwort. It's not going into too many really intact ecosystems yet, but it outcompetes the plants that evolved here and provides some services to the ecosystem. So plants that either have are food plants for insects and caterpillars that become butterflies. Another thing that's really important people to understand is that birds and snakes and lizards and frogs, they all rely on insects as a protein source. But plants that don't have many insects on them don't provide that food source. So they're kind of like a block in the food chain in the ecosystem. So if you have plants that are providing food to the insects, they're moving that sun's energy into protein. And that's especially important, like when in the spring when birds have babies, they can't feed their babies berries, they feed them mostly insects. Even berry-eating birds will mostly eat insects and feed them to their babies so they have the protein, and also to make their eggs. So it's very important that we're growing food for insects. And most people don't want to do that. They want plants that will resist insects so they don't have any holes in their leaves. But you look at some of the really fine Japanese paintings of plants, and you see holes. They look realistic. They're not just a pristine plastic-looking version of a plant. So we're trying to get people to understand and appreciate the need for having plants that fit into that ecosystem. And stinkwort isn't one of them. It came from Southern Europe and Northern Africa, and it doesn't get eaten by anything. It doesn't have the chemistry that the insects here can live with.
It's like a super plant.
Well, it's not a super plant where it lives in Europe. I mean, well, it has become invasive also in other parts of Europe, but there are some of our invasive species, like Cape ivy, that are actually struggling in their native ecosystems because they have things that are controlling them. They've left behind the diseases and the pests, the insects that eat them, so they can really outcompete here. So it's really important for us to get in and try and control some of these plants, especially when they're relatively new. Some of the plants have been here a long time. They came with the first missionaries with their cattle, and things like the oat grasses are going to be really hard to ever eradicate. We won't ever eradicate them. But I think with stinkwort, we have an opportunity to actually eradicate it because it's only been around since 1984, first found in Milpitas. So we have more of it in the Bay Area than a lot of other counties do. But, and another advantage we have with that plant is it's got a short-lived seed, so it only lives for a couple of years, whereas things like French broom, that's also very invasive and is going into good quality ecosystems in the foothills, the seed bank can live for 80 years.
Wow.
So our great-grandchildren will be helping us to remove those plants from the ecosystem, and I hope they will continue to be interested to do that. It's very important.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's...
So is there a difference between, I think we touched on this earlier, a difference between an invasive plant and just a non-native? I mean,
Right.
could you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah,
What makes
so-
something invasive?
Right, what makes it invasive is its ability to take over in an ecosystem, and generally that's has to do with the amount of seed it makes, how well it's adapted to this ecosystem. So a lot of the invasive plants are Mediterranean. They can survive in a dry summer like we have in California, or at least this area of California. And so wet winter, dry summer, it depends on the soil conditions. What will be invasive in some parts of California won't be invasive in others. So if we have intact serpentine soils, like we have up at Edgewood Preserve, used to be intact serpentine soils, which meant that it's the native rock serpentine that created the soils, and they're very low in nutrients. So a lot of native plants can thrive there because the European ones can't outcompete. But now that we're driving our cars up and down 280, the smog, the pollution from our tailpipes is depositing nitrogen into those serpentine soils. So we can actually change the conditions through our daily activities of driving up and down the freeways so that native plants are having a harder time out competing the non-native
What are
plants.
some more at-risk areas for stinkwort? Like, what are some areas where it might thrive?
Yeah, so it's coming into a lot of grassland areas. That's where its original habitat is. So places, there are, some intact native grasslands in the area, so that's what we're mostly concerned about. But we're also just concerned about it taking over areas where wildflower seeds would otherwise thrive. A lot of our nice poppy fields are in grasslands, and so the stinkwort will definitely reduce that. Poppies are a really good plant for our native bumblebees. And we're learning more and more that native bees are really important to our well-being as people, not just aesthetically to admire them, but bumblebees are particularly well made for pollinating tomato plants or things in that family. They have a mechanism to buzz pollinate, which means they just hold on to the flower and go bzzz at the right frequency to get the pollen to shake out onto their little hairy bodies and move it from plant to plant. So if we want our tomatoes to do well in our garden and produce lots of fruit, we need bees like the bumblebees. So if we have lots of poppies in the area, we're going to also have more tomatoes. So there's also bees that are really good at pollinating blueberry plants. The manzanita flower is the same style of flower. It's in the heath family, and they have little bell-shaped flowers, and there's little tiny bees that fit right inside those flowers. So if we have more manzanita, we'll have more blueberry fruit. People are learning more and more how to manage for the bees, putting in what they need for their homes. A lot of them need bare soil, so if we use less mulch in all of our gardens, we'll have some area in our garden that's not all covered with wood chips. Those bees can get into holes in the ground. And if we have bundles of little straws or holes drilled into wood, then the wood nesting bees, which are about 30% of our native bees, will find a place to nest. And so, so not only having native plants, but also having the habitat where they need to live
insects,
for these insects.
And I think the other thing you touched upon as well is people haven't really talked too much about how honeybees, which we used to be everywhere and are not native, they came from Italy or someplace, they came from Europe.
Right.
But they've been affected by a lot of diseases, so we're seeing...
Right, so the importance of the native
bee
take over some of that pollinating role.
Exactly.
Right, it's very important.
So I guess I would want to know also, how do you tell a native plant from an invasive? Are there some plants that we might accidentally rip out?
Yes, that is a concern. And there have been some that have been traditionally ripped out, like thistles. People think of all thistles as being European, but we have some native thistles that are important for people to be careful not to pull. Generally, they're a little bit different color. They're more red, or there's a cobweb thistle that has cobwebby-like structure over its flower. But it's important there's a few that you really want to be extra careful with. And I mentioned Cape ivy, and I have found people pulling what we have called wild cucumber or mara out of trees because they're assuming because it looks very much like it, although it has kind of a fuzzy leaf instead of a glossy leaf. So stinkwort is another one of those that it's got some kind of close-looking native plants to compare to. And the one I'm most concerned about people pulling up is tarweed, because tarweed, some of my coworkers like to call it tar plant, because I want it to have a little more positive of a connotation. It's not,
Instead of being a
we don't
weed.
consider it a weed because it fits into the ecosystem, and there are butterflies that need it for a host plant, and there are a lot of bees that use the flowers. It's also sticky and smelly, so that's why stinkwort is called stinkwort. Wort is generally a plant that has some kind of a use, and so in medicinal use, or the one I know that they've used stinkwort for is as to control mites in chickens. So I don't know how
Well, what's the best way to tell apart the stinkwort from one of these
from the
native?
tarweed. Yeah, that's a good question. So
Because I'm going to be one of the people
just out
ripping
there pulling. No,
everything
you
out.
want to look. Sometimes they can be kind of bushy, the stinkworts, but in general they have what we call an apical dominance. They like to grow with their center growing up straight. So we tell people they look like a little Christmas tree. The tarweeds are more of a bushy look to them, and they branch more in different directions. The smell of it is very medicinal smelling, not as, I think of the tarweed as being kind of a more minty, sagey sort of, you walk through tarweed and you come in and people go, oh, the smell of California summer, it's just kind of a nice smell. But you walk through stinkwort and somebody's like, oh, did you just put Vaseline or, what do they call it? Methyl, what I'm
like
talking about, the old...
Mercurochrome or something,
No, well,
right?
I'm thinking of, Vicks Vapor Rub.
yeah, there we go.
Vicks Vapor Rub smell
really?
to it,
It's
more of
pretty
that kind of strong medicinal,
Camphor
camphory
smell.
kind of.
Yeah.
So that's part of it. There are tarweeds that are yellow. The hayfield tarweed that grows more commonly, at least in the Palo Alto foothills, is a white flower. But there are, like a Stolstaff Park in Redwood City, there are a lot of tarweeds that have a yellow flower. But those, again, are a different form, a larger flower. These are small flowers, and the plant has lots of hairs all over it, and the strong smell and that conical shape. So I think those are the most
Think little
important
Christmas tree.
features to look for. Think little Christmas tree.
Little
And
stinky Christmas
right
tree.
now, it's a little late to try to remove them, although there still is seed. So if you have them in your yard or see them close by or some open space you want to remove them from, just make sure you have a bag to put right over the top before you pull it out so that the seed gets contained. But the best time to pull it is when the ground is, it's a little bit of a challenge because when you first start to really see that it's a stinkwort plant is later in the summer when the ground is hard. If you wait till the rains come, often it's already started to seed. So it goes into flower in September. It seems to be very regular that way. It's just a daylight phenomenon, how much light it gets. It starts putting out those flowers. If you cut it when it has its flowers, it will continue to go to seed. So you can't just pile it up and count on the seed not forming.
So ideally, you'd take it out in August. But if you
Ideally, you
don't,
take it out in August.
But if you
exactly.
don't, then
if you don't, you need
take
to bag
precautions.
it. You can put it in a black plastic bag with a cup of water and leave it out in the sun to cook before you put it in the compost so that we're not spreading it. I believe that the main way we've got it in our bayland areas, like up at Bixby Park, has come from the landfill. So people removing it and putting it into their compost, and then it's blown and filled in, where the old landfill area. It could be also that they brought in fill that had seed in it, which is where I first really started worrying about it was when I saw a lot of construction sites. And I mentioned to Sue that we saw up on the roofs of the green roofs at Foothill College. So they're trying to plant those with native species, and a number of stinkworts were imported with the soil. So that's a very unfortunate place to find it, because if you have it on the roof, the seeds will blow even farther afield.
How did it actually get from Europe out here?
That's a really good question. So, some of our invasive species, the one I have the biggest bone to pick with right now is privet. People plant that in their yard, and the birds move it all over the place. Birds don't get much value from it because it's kind of a laxative for the birds. It just goes right through, and if you have a white car like mine that parks under a tree and you see purple polka dots all over it, the birds didn't get that food value. It's all over my car, but the seeds are spreading. I pull a dozen of them out of my yard almost every week. So that's one that we brought in on purpose, and there are several like that. But the stinkwort we did not bring in on purpose. It's not a very attractive plant. It doesn't have any garden value, but it came in likely. A lot of the weeds we're getting in from Europe these days are coming in with nursery stock. So it's another reason to buy locally grown, local species, is that we import a lot of diseases and weed species in with our plants that we buy from other parts of the world. They think the sudden oak death came in with, I think it was a rhododendron plant from Germany or somewhere in Europe. So, not only weeds, but diseases that are wreaking havoc for our ecosystem. So that's it's another strong argument for buying local native plants, is that we don't import these seeds and diseases.
Well, I had a triad of questions. One was, you and I talked about, and getting back to the tarweed, that it actually might possibly be able to keep stinkwort at bay. Could you talk about that a little?
Well, it fills the same niche as far as a plant that comes up later in the summer and goes to flower. So oftentimes where we have an intact tarweed population, we don't see the stinkwort moving in. I have seen them grow side by side. I have to say, on top of that, up at Gunn High School, the Strawberry Hill, the first place where I worked on stinkwort was several years ago. I organized a group of neighbors there to come out and help me remove it, because it had come in probably on tires of bicycles, because there are a lot of kids that were piling up dirt and making bike jumps and stuff like that, and that's where we first started seeing it growing. They may have also imported some with some soil, because there was a bank of them along the fence where they built the new baseball area there at Gunn High School. So there's a beautiful stand of native tarweed. Unfortunately, it gets mowed a lot because they mow for fire issues up there. The school district has maintenance responsibilities for that site. So I'm a little worried that we're going to harm the tarweed population by mowing before it goes to seed. So I should talk to the school district more about that. But there were places down the hill from the tarweed where the stinkwort was coming up and the tarweed was going down, and they were side by side. And so then it's a little more challenging to figure out what you've got. And so smelling and looking at the shape and things like that are really important.
So in terms of dedication, let's say, from government agencies to fund eradication of invasive stinkwort and others, what does that picture look like? Is there very much money out there?
There is not very much money, sadly. When I first started working with grassroots ecology, it was a little better, and I hope that the state will see in their wisdom to add money to the budget. The Department of Food and Ag had a budget that went to every county. It was not a very large amount, but at least it helped some of these projects. Actually, one of our first stinkwort projects was funded by one of those WMA grants. We had stinkwort, jointed goat grass, and Medusa head grass as three things that were fairly newly coming into Arastradero Preserve. And so the WMA funded us for, I think it was for 2 or 3 years, to focus on those plants. And then that funding ended. And it's been 7 or 8 years. We had money lined up to work on Cape Ivy and San Francisco Creek through the WMA the year that they pulled the funding. So that effort still has yet to be funded. So yes, it's really important that people who are concerned about this vocalize their concern to our legislators and make sure that budget includes some money for weed eradication, because it's a whole ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. If we keep waiting, the cost is going to be a lot higher.
So what is, given that they're mostly, and I know grassroots ecology works with a lot of volunteers to get rid of stinkwort and other invasive plants, assuming that we are all willing volunteers, at least on, for our own private properties and maybe when we're out on a hike, what's the best way for us to handle stinkwort? Are there particular ways of getting it out that you recommend?
Yes, I highly recommend trying to hand pull it in the late summer. You can just chop it. There are some plants where you have to be really careful to dig down an inch because they have stem tissue that goes down under the ground and they'll re-sprout. Stinkwort, it seems like you just have to get a little bit below the level of the soil. So if you could pull it with a root, that's ideal. If you pull and it breaks off, then it's best to use a little hand mattock and just chop down a little bit to get that out. If you do it early in the season and you cut too high, or if you mow, then it will still flower, but at a really low, right to the ground where it's very hard to control it. So mowing won't work unless you do it late enough in the season that it doesn't have any energy left to go to flower.
Oh, I see. So it's later in the season that you should do it.
That you should mow.
Okay, for
Yeah.
mowing. And I understand that it can sometimes cause allergic reactions to people.
Right, that's a
so-
good point. Yes, so it's really important to wear gloves when you're pulling it. It can form a contact dermatitis. I personally haven't experienced it.
And probably
I'm
not
very
rub-
allergic to poison oak, but it seems not to stinkwort. So.
And probably not rub your nose or your eyes, right?
Right, you would not want to get it in your eyes.
I'm very allergic to mole plant, gopher spurge.
Oh, right.
And boy, I swelled up like a balloon from that stuff, just scratching or whatever.
Getting it in.
So
Right.
yeah,
So
I think it's very easy with plants like that to
Yeah, you
that
have to be
effect.
careful about that. But
I'm sorry.
no, I was just going to say, if you get it early enough, you can either just pile it up to compost on your property if you have a site that you're willing to do that, or put it into the city compost. But again, if you're going to do it after it flowers or it has seeds on it, I highly recommend first what we call solarizing it in black plastic.
So you said you put like a cup of water
Put
in
a
there?
little bit of water, it kind of helps steam it. If it's too dry, it doesn't really get hot enough in there to, so that helps. to
So you
kill it.
solarize it and that would kill the
Kill the
seeds?
seeds or the flowers before they go to
Like
seed.
cooking them.
Cooking them a little bit, right?
Yeah. I know in Sue's article today, she quoted a Berkeley nonprofit that gave kind of ratings for threat levels, and stinkwort was considered moderate, and it said it had a high potential for spreading. Is that high potential because of the number of seeds, or because it just seems sort of immune to
I think it's partly the number of seeds. It's also the fact that it's relatively new. So, if we let it go, we might see a much larger population of it.
Yeah,
Having started in the South Bay and moving its way up, I think it's
creeping.
really
Yeah.
important to try and get it around the edges and bring it in
Yeah.
that way.
I imagine that there's any number of invasive plants. So is this a particularly good time then to be hitting the stinkwort as opposed to other threatening species?
Right, it's
How do you manage that?
What
What to go after?
When there's so much to go after?
Right. So there's a lot of good information on the California Invasive Plant Council website about what plants are rated in what way, and also eradication methods for those plants. So I highly recommend looking at CalIPC, California Invasive Plant Council's website. But generally ones that are early detected are good ones to go for.
Yeah, you can have the biggest impact.
Right, but even ones that have been around a long time, if they're threatening high-quality habitat or something special. So we have had some funding from Fish and Wildlife through their Preventing Extinction grant to work on a plant that's around a long time, Arundo donax. It's called giant reed. It looks like a tall bamboo. And it's its biggest problems in watersheds, like down by the bay or in creeks. And it was taking over one of the few stands of a native thistle, fountain thistle. It grows only in serpentine seeps. And so even if it's a plant that's been around a long time, but it's threatening something very special that we want to keep, then it's really worth working on. So it's a combination of factors that helps us to decide where and put our efforts.
Yeah, sounds like vigilance is a
Right.
large part of your work, just to know
Right.
what's happening and what's growing and creeping up. Yeah. Well, Claire Elliott, thank you so much for joining
my
us
pleasure.
today.
I'm
This has
glad to
been
have
really
the opportunity
informative.
to share. You can tell I care about this issue.
You've been working on it for a long time.
Yeah, so I hope that people will work in their own lands to control stinkwort and other invasive species, and they can always come and learn by doing, by signing up for one of our volunteer events.
days.
So
Yeah. So we've got more information on stinkwort, how to manage it, how to recognize it on Palo Alto Online with Sue's article. Also one
Sue.
about how Los Altos Hills took the battle to the weeds and involved neighbors and residents and looked at that problem and came up with effective solutions. So
kids are also getting involved. We
Are they really?
There was a Girl Scout whose father's a ranger up at Jasper Ridge who did an educational effort for her own neighborhood. So it's something that I think a lot of young people are
get-
starting to care about.
get behind. Good to hear. All right. Well, thank you very much. You can always catch the latest on paloaltoonline.com. If you like the webcast and want to subscribe, just click the link below or like us. We're also on social media, so Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. You can find us there. We will see you next week.